at a cocktail party and people say, tell me about it, I say, don't even get me started. You know, you want to be here for 6 hours listening to a raving madman. This is the wrong question to ask, you know. The one thing I want to say about it is, it's not, I guess, the most popular thing to write a book. It wouldn't appeal to the American mainstream, I can imagine, to write a book that essentially says, this is the twilight period of American civilization, and there really isn't a whole lot we can do about that. That's just the way it is. So, I mean, on one level, it's going to run against the grain of American optimism, which goes back at least to Ralph Waldo Emerson. And if you weren't raised on that, you were raised on Walt Disney. So basically all our feelings are, there's always an answer and everything's fine, really, and so on. And yet at the same time, that, it would be something that I think wouldn't be easily accepted. The truth is that the argument is a no-brainer. The obviousness of it seems to me quite clear. At this, 1 week after this book was released, Jacques Barzun published a book called Dawn to Decadence, which argues the same thing. He says this is the twilight phase of our culture. In fact, he's more pessimistic than I am. He predicts a renaissance for about 300 years from now. I figure maybe the 22nd century. I'm not sure, So Jacques and I have to have a little talk, But to me, it's an obvious, I mean, the central thesis is an obvious historical fact, and that is to say, there are no exceptions. All civilizations come to an end. There's just no exception on the historical record, and why would we be the exception? If somebody came up to you in the street and said, I've decided to live forever, you would say, this is called denial. It's quite clear. And so the real question is not whether the American civilization is going to come undone. It's when, okay? And I'm pegging it for the later part of this century. This is a difficult book also to, to do a reading from, because it has very different parts. And I sort of am worried about misleading the audience. That is to say, if I pick, there are a number of diverse topics, although it comes together, and knits together as a whole, I believe. There are a number of diverse topics in this, so there's a problem for me of, if I just pick one part, you'll think that's what the book is about. And there are other parts. So I'd like to give you a little roadmap, basically, just talk, what the outline is. The comparison I make, of course, is with the Roman Empire. Just as though, as politically, for several hundred years we had a Pax Romana, now we've had, for a century and probably, much of the century to come, a Pax Americana, although the Roman one was political and ours is economic. 4 factors, as far as I can see, were involved in that disintegration. The first is enormous gap between rich and poor. In the Rome of Nero's time, and that's early still, 54 to 68 AD, 2,000 individuals owned all of the land between the Rhine and the Euphrates. I mean, that's just breathtaking. Well, 1% of the American public owns 47% of the wealth. That's breathtaking too. And lots of statistics. John Cassidy does all this stuff regularly in the New Yorker, really, of CEO salaries and the ratios. 1950, the ratio of CEO to average worker in a company was 40 to 1 salary ratio. It's now over 400 to 1. I mean, all of these things are quite clear. It's never been like this, even in the Gilded Age of the robber barons. It was not like this in the United States. The second is an idea that strikes me as very important, that I take from Joseph Tainter's book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, which I think was published in '89. Tainter argues that there comes a point in the decline of every culture where what happens is very obvious and very economic. That is to say, a point is reached at which the money that's collected for taxes dead ends. It just recycles into the bureaucracy that collects the taxes. So you're not getting anywhere. You're running like a rat on a treadmill. And what then happens is, so you start off in the growth phase, and every culture goes through growth, birth, efflorescence, and decay. That's just it. So what happens, you plateau out for a while, and then the thing that starts to turn is when you're collecting money just to keep the money-collecting machinery going. And I think we're about 10 or 15 years away from that. But the handwriting is on the wall. We're going to run out of money for Medicare if nothing is done. 2015, Social Security runs out 2034. These are major entitlement programs that we can't exactly sidestep, and they require enormous amounts of money, and they're not going to be there. So there's a point of diminishing returns, and that's Tainter's argument. The third is a decline of literacy and intellectual awareness, general intellectual awareness. This has become so obvious that I really probably don't have to even mention this to this audience. Common words are now misspelled on CNN and in supermarkets. They never get Caesar salad right. Have you noticed that? It's only 5 more years they won't be able to get salad right. Really, I mean, this is not a joke. It's just a matter of time. And you just run into this all the time. I mean, there's just some wonderful, horrible stuff. Woman interviewed by a newspaper in Sheboygan, Illinois, on the street. They were interviewing people on the street, asking if people thought George W. Bush was intelligent enough to be president. She replied, "He's pretty smart, but he doesn't know very much." A good Bush voter, I would say. We've got a presidential candidate. It's amazing that he would even be considered, and the chances are he's going to win. Dumb as a stick. Doonesbury has done a great job of just quoting from campaign speeches. We ought to make the pie higher. I understand small business growth. I was one. Rarely is the question asked, is our children learning? Clearly he wasn't. He probably hasn't read a serious book in his life. But the stats, 60% of Americans have never read a single book. 120 million Americans are functionally illiterate. I mean, wow. We are 48th in literacy in the world, 48th. So, there's lots of material on this. And then the fourth factor is what I call spiritual death, essentially apathy. This was the thesis of Oswald Spengler in The Decline of the West, where he said basically a civilization comes to the point where it's just repackaging old formulas. And so it has all the old slogans, but they've become kitsch. And in a sense, the governments are corrupt. People don't take what's going on seriously. I mean, a woman, I was just reading last week, some woman at a right-wing think tank compared the current presidential election to a student government election, in high school. It's about as significant, kind of thing. And with that, an enormous sense of ennui and really a lack of civility. The same, I was reading this from Doonesbury, that same weekend, George Will did a piece in Outlook called A Gross Out Culture, and he just listed that common lack of civility. I mean, I'm sure you've all got your anecdotes. I run into it on a daily basis, 4 years ago, for the first time I'd ever seen this, the Chronicle of Higher Education began to have lists for conferences on the erosion of civility in the United States. I had never seen that before. All this is relatively new. So those are, I mean, just to give you that roadmap, those are 4 factors that are involved in decline. And then I talk about a number of other things. For example, I discuss how decline of civilization has been treated in literature in various ways. There's a whole discussion of what I call, the whole dialectic of the American economy, starting with an Enlightenment tradition and a very vibrant sort of economic beginnings in the 18th century, and how the pursuit of that itself finally winds up with the kind of corporate consumerism and set of values that we have today. There's a chapter Matthew was mentioning about the monastic option. That was originally the working title of this book, The Monastic Option. And what I was talking about was, if we're going to make comparisons with Rome, there is one gleam of light here. That is that starting from about the 4th century, but certainly taking off by the 6th century, there was a group, I would hesitate to say a class, but a group of monks, Benedictine and also in Ireland, so Benedictine of the